We are back from break. It is 3:20 p.m. and we are picking up with the Regional Housing Council presentation. And it's right back to, okay, Tom and Keely are here with us. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Tom Webster with the Office of Housing and Homeless Prevention.
And Keely Marino with the Thurston County Homeless Response Coordinator. Oh, no, I'm a program manager now.
All right, and we're here to talk to you about the Regional Housing Council. So we've got a, there you go. So going to provide a little bit of an overview of what the RHC has done this year, what their plans are for next year. Talk a little bit about the funding that comes through the Regional Housing Council. There's been some changes, post-emergency funding, and then talk a little bit more focused on the home fund and some of the affordable housing strategies and permanent supportive housing going forward. So just to recap some of the highlights for what the RHC has been working on the past year is in March, I believe it was, they established the Homeless Services Advisory Board and the Affordable Housing Advisory Board. So these are two citizen-based advisory boards that review funding applications, help set priorities, and make recommendations to the full Regional Housing Council. So it took a lot of work to get these boards established. We're pleased with the way they've started off. They hit the ground running, and they continue to grow as they build their expertise. But they've already kind of the next point is gone through 2 requests for proposals, one in the spring that we issued in February. Those applications were due late March, and so they reviewed those applications. And then we had a second funding round for capital dollars this summer that the Affordable Housing Advisory Board also reviewed. In total, through those RFPs, there was over $13.5 million of grants that we awarded to over 51 projects. So you have seen and approved those. But those advisory boards were really a starting point for developing the RFPs, reviewing those applications, and making the recommendations. So I'm pleased with those getting off the ground. Recently, the RHC has approved a work plan for itself for the remainder of this year and through 2024, and I'll go into those details in just a minute here. And then it continues to support some regional projects, including the right-of-way initiative through the governor's office, and also the Franz Anderson Permanent Supportive Housing Project that will be coming, is moving forward with City of Olympia taking the lead on that. So in terms of their work plan for the remainder of this year and in 2024, one of the things the RHC, the technical team, so the staff from Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, Yelm, and Thurston County have been working on is the cities have all created housing action plans under some funding working with TRPC and then some funding from the state. So they have housing action plans. So one of the things we're doing is doing a crosswalk between all those action plans to see where the commonalities are and what are the issues we want to work on regionally rather than having each jurisdiction working on those items separately, working on those as a region. So we're going through that process right now. And then identifying those things that, maybe one jurisdiction takes the lead on that they can share with the other jurisdictions, and then what are items that the Regional Housing Council can take the lead on. So some of those things broadly are around, funding issues, education and outreach activities, and perhaps some policy issues as well. So we're kind of doing that crosswalk. We've also done, so we presented earlier this year the fair housing assessment. So within that, the RHC is planning to look at that in more detail and say, what are some things that the RHC can take on specific to that fair housing assessment. We've hired Elisa Sparkman with the county, who's really taken on the role as the communications lead for the Regional Housing Council. So she's developed a communications plan to ensure that news releases, information, we have an RHC website that is under our office's website to the county where we post notices of meetings, our minutes, and whatnot. So she's really working on developing a communications plan. Continuing to move forward, the Franz Anderson Permanent Supportive Housing Interlocal Agreement. We're hoping to be a regional project with City of Olympia taking the lead, but also funding from the county, Lacey, Tumwater in this. So we're negotiating the interlocal agreement that we hope to bring to you before the end of the year. So we're working on some final language on that. So that is moving forward. We're also working on an affordable housing funding strategy. So a bigger picture, taking a step back, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but really just making sure our funding is aligned, better aligned with the state funding, low-income housing tax credits, housing trust fund dollars, and just thinking about doing our pipeline, and so taking a bigger picture look at our affordable housing funding. Quinn Street Village, so the City of Olympia has been operating Quinn Street Village, so the Regional Housing Council is, that's really a regional asset, and so looking at a long-term funding strategy for that. The RHC is talking about a legislative agenda item and how the RHC wants to bring forward some ideas and issues to bring forward to the legislature. We also want to establish what we're calling a harm and emergency abatement response team. So this would be similar to the hazardous weather task force that's really focused on potential sweeps of unsheltered encampments. So making sure there's good coordination and communication between the jurisdictions and the various partners who are involved if a sweep happens. And then just the ongoing activities for the RHC, including to be the funding cycle oversight and the right-of-way initiative. So a couple changes to our funding that have happened really this year. So the next slide goes into a little bit. We had some COVID and other funds from the state that have ended. And we are really worried. This past year, we've seen a substantial reduction in document recording fees. So document recording fees are one of the primary sources of funds that we receive to fund both our homeless services as well as affordable housing. And also some of those document recording fees really come through the state. So you've heard 1277, something we've mentioned before. So what the ledge did this past year is there was 3 or 4 different RCWs that all address different document recording fees for different purposes. So what they did is they consolidated those all into one bill. So in the past, we've talked about 2163 and 2060 and 1277. They are now all consolidated under a new Senate Bill 5386. We're still kind of in a transition. We're still kind of referring to those buckets of money. There was no substantial change in how those funds can be used or the amount of money that we'll be receiving, but it's just been consolidated, which makes it a little easier to review. So you might see some changes in some of the numbers we use for this going forward. There's also some new long-term funding for homeless services through the state. This includes an emergency housing fund that will come from, currently is being funded with federal dollars, but in the future will be state allocated dollars. The eviction prevention rent assistance program was actually a subset of document recording fees that run through the state. And then Apple Health and Home, we're expecting some permanent supportive housing dollars under the Apple Health and Home program. Those are still under development. We expect to learn more about those in early 2024. In addition, to make up for that document recording fee funding gap, as I've said, we've seen about a 40–50% reduction in document recording fees with rising interest rates. Nobody's refinancing their mortgages these days, so there has been a substantial reduction. So the state has backfilled some of those with some CHG as Consolidated Homeless Grant inflationary funds, as well as some document recording fee supplemental funds, but those are one-time funds that we don't expect to continue. So those are some new sources. And then what's going away is the COVID-related rent assistance programs. So these were ERAP, ERAP2, TRAP, TRAP2 that we referred to. So those all ended in July of this year. We're gonna be coming back to you in early November to give you a summary of how that went. We spent over $55 million in rent assistance since the beginning of the pandemic, and we did a survey. So we'll present some of those results to you about that survey. Also, there was the Emergency Solutions Grant COVID funding that came through the state. So we received around close to $5 million in that during COVID. And so that funding has expired. And the state also had a shelter program grant that started right before the pandemic began. That was not COVID related, but kind of the timing coincided with COVID. That program is also ended. So they really took the ESG and the shelter program grant and really moved those funds or created the emergency housing grant. So that was kind of where those programs have moved. So some changes in kind of the funds that have coming in. So the next slide just really is a summary of all the fund sources for homeless services that we have. When I started with the county, 7 years ago, I think we had 3 homeless services funds and 2 affordable housing funds, and now we've got 11 different fund sources coming into us. So these are kind of just showing our 23-24 funding levels and a higher level sense of what they are used for. So these are primarily on this first page, really our homeless services funding. And so those support our shelters, permanent housing, rent assistance, and those types of things. The next page is our capital dollars. So again, the 2060 and Home Investment Partnership are federal dollars. Those are what our entitlement programs. 1406 is a relatively new fund. It's been around for a couple of years. This is the retention of state sales tax that we get to hold on to. So that's around 900,000. We combine those funds regionally. So we actually collect funds from Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Yelm, as well as the county. So that makes up the $900,000 as a region that we collect through those funds. The home ARP is a one-time allocation of funding. So we have about 2.9 million of that will go into capital projects. And then our combined county and Olympia home funds, those are the local sales tax dollars. So we've have about 4.4 million of those for capital projects this year. And on the previous page, we've allocated around 1.3 million or so for homeless services activities. So more specifically around the local home fund strategy and how we are using those funds. So as I just said, our intent is to really allocate about 30% of our local home fund to maintain current homeless services, especially with the reduction of document recording fees. Someday we may revisit that if document recording fee revenue picks back up, but for the next kind of year or two at least, we anticipate continuing to allocate 30% for services. The RHC a couple of years ago created a permanent supportive housing framework. So there's been a real emphasis at the RHC to develop additional permanent supportive housing units. So that's been a focus of the RHC. And so you'll see there's a lot of projects, permanent supportive housing projects that are under development. So again, going back to the Thurston Affordable Housing Advisory Board, is making recommendations to the RHC on funding priorities. During the 2023 RFP, they didn't identify any specific priorities for those funds. They really wanted to see what was out there, get a broad view. So this summer we had about 5.5 million to award, and we received over $14 million in requests. So it just shows that there continues to be a strong demand for capital affordable housing dollars. As I also mentioned earlier, the advisory board is now working on thinking of the capital pipeline, so trying to identify what are those projects 2 or 3 years out that we want to fund. A lot of times the local dollars we put in are the first money in, which allows them to then go and leverage housing trust fund or low-income housing tax credit projects. So our money is a lot of times the first money in. So want to identify those projects early so those projects can plan for those resources. And then again, the affordable housing funding strategy, really looking at off-cycle funding requests, aligning better with state funding resources, and then those pipeline parameters. And then the other thing I'll throw out there is as the HB 1220 planning efforts continue in terms of the allocation of how much affordable housing our county needs to develop over the next, 30 years. As we get those numbers from the planning side of the shop, we'll be incorporating those into the RHC's funding strategies going forward. So I've heard those may be coming later this year.
Should be coming soon.
Yeah. So, all right. And then finally, just wanted to highlight some of the permanent supportive housing projects. These are not all the capital projects that the RHC has supported, but really with that focus on permanent supportive housing. In 2020, we had approximately 200 units of permanent supportive housing in our county. And you can see kind of over a 5-year period between 21 and 2026, we hope to create over 400 new units of permanent supportive housing. So a pretty substantial increase that, from the Lehigh Unity Commons Phase 1 that opened in 2021 with 65 units They're currently under construction for phase 2. That's gonna be another 63 units that will open in late 2024. Family Support Center, their landing project is getting near completion. That may be done by the end of this year, or early 2024. That's another 62 units specifically for families. It's not technically permanent support housing, but it does come with supportive services. The Lehigh Franz Anderson project will create 71 units, and with funding, assuming that moves forward, is scheduled to be completed in 2026. There's also a new project, 228 Olympia, which is a consortium of an organization developer called Together We Grow and Interfaith Works. They're targeting to build 83 units in downtown Olympia, hoping that will be completed in 2026, and that is a project that the RHC supported with local home fund and home ARP dollars this summer. And then the Maple Court project with Lehigh, currently it's an enhanced shelter, but the plan is to convert those in the next 2 to 4 years to permanent supportive housing. So that will be another 118 units of permanent supportive housing coming online. So all total, I think that's, a little over 400 units of housing. So I think that's been a real emphasis of the RHC, and something that will substantially increase the capacity of PSH in our county. So with that, I know I went through that relatively quickly. The other thing I wanted to point out is in your packet, we did include this big spreadsheet. I know the print is very small, but this is just a summary of all the contracts we've awarded, that you've awarded this year with funding. So it includes kind of by all the funding sources we have, and then the list of all the projects. So that's just for your.
I'm not sure that we have that, Tom.
Okay, I did send it over with the PowerPoints, but I'm happy to resend those.
Then that is my fault and I failed everybody.
And if it wasn't in the email, then that's my fault. I intended to send it over.
So we'll get it. And what is the sheet again? I think we're all looking for it, so we.
Yeah, it's just
I do have it and I can get it to you commissioners. Sorry about that,
It's a
Tom.
sheet of what?
it's a sheet of all the contracts, the awards from this year that you've made. So it's just a list of all the agencies and projects.
51 projects you listed
51
at the
project, yeah.
front slide.
Okay, that's great. Questions?
Have we come up with the criteria to take care of our own homegrown residents first? Yeah.
That is not identified as a way to, by the state and by our federal funders to prioritize people in projects.
I guess my question stems from, I understand that the governor is trying to put another $4 billion into the solution of homelessness. And my concern is that if we don't put some restrictions or at least criteria for selection in place, we're gonna have everybody in the United States coming here to receive services